live streaming on Facebook, and we are here in the Zoom, also on YouTube, I believe. Welcome everybody. My name is Michael Frogalla. I'm with the Ebert Foundation in Washington, DC, and I'm very excited that we have three distinguished guests today to talk about the first 100 days and new US policy in foreign relations. There are a lot of interesting things happening right now today and in general these weeks. So there's a lot of ground to cover and we don't have too much time. So let me just welcome everyone online and especially welcome here in the chat. I'd like to welcome Congressman Boyle for joining us and the German Member of Parliament, Nils Schmid, who's joining us from Germany, and of course, Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, who's joining us from Harvard, I believe. And I'll really quickly gonna introduce the moderator, and then I will give it over to you. Cathryn, first of all, thank you so much for coming. You are in the midst of moving, I believe, and but you're still in Harvard, at the Harvard Kennedy School, where you direct or have directed two interesting programs on diplomacy and on Europe. And I also read that you started your career as a journalist at CNN. I thought I mentioned that because that is pretty cool. You're also a dual citizen, German and American, which we have in common. And I think that's pretty cool. But you are basically days away from changing to a new leadership position. You are taking over as head of the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, or in English, the German Council on Foreign Relations. So that is really exciting, a big institution, a very important institution in Germany. And I look forward to working with you there. And we wish you very much success. And with that, I hand it over to you. And thank you so much, guys, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for having us. Me, in particular, I'm happy to host this on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. I don't think yesterday we knew just how timely this conversation could be. We have basically a speed round of around 40 minutes to talk about some of the pressing issues in the transatlantic relationship. And of course, we'll have to start with what happened in the last 24 hours. So I look forward to asking our two guests to reflect on that, and then a number of the key issues that we have on our list, not least, of course, because we have some summitry coming up between Europe and the United States, not least the NATO summit on June 14th, but of course an EU-US summit, which will be in some regards almost a historic novelty because it's been so long since we've had a functional EU-US summit. So we have much to discuss in these short minutes, but let me introduce our formidable guests to you. You can see that they're both very young and dynamic parliamentarians. So I think this is also in many ways a conversation that is really future bound. So Congressman Brendan Boyle is serving his third term in Congress, representing the 2nd District in his home state of Pennsylvania. And it includes parts of Philadelphia, which is critical for all of us when we think about the cradle of American democracy. He served for 2 years on the very influential House Foreign Affairs Committee and has now turned his mind, his expertise, and his thinking to the House Ways and Means Committee. And so I was just thanking him before for the House Ways and Means Committee work and the work on the Budget Committee, because we're entering a crucial phase here in the United States. But he's also, for this conversation, importantly, a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So he's just come back from meeting, both virtually, his fellow members of the Assembly and focusing specifically on US-EU-Russia relations. So we look forward to hearing from you there, Congressman Boyle. And Nils Schmid joins us from Germany. I'm not sure if he's in Berlin or in Nürtingen, where he is from. He is a member of the German Bundestag. He's a frequently viewed and opinionated member of the Social Democratic Party because he is the speaker of his party on foreign affairs. He's a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and he was previously the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance and Economics in Baden-Württemberg, his home state. So welcome to both of you. So I don't think had this necessarily on our radar, the events of the last 24 hours, which I think we can now describe as fundamentally a hijacking and an overreach of Belarusian national power. I think we can speculate that the actions taken toward the Ryanair flight that brought down this commercial airliner and ultimately ended with the removal of a Belarusian dissident by Belarusian authorities, as an overreach of state intervention and something that likely Russia will have known about. So because the reactions are still so necessary now, we have seen strong expressions of opposition, both from the American government and of course from different parts of not only the EU, but also of national governments. So I wanted to get both of your reflections on what do we do in this moment of urgency? What do we do as a transatlantic partnership to push back against this overreach? And how do we think about the next weeks and months to come? So Congressman Boyle, let's start with you. What was your readout as events were happening yesterday?
Well, first, Cathryn, thank you. It's great to be with you. I should have mentioned earlier, right before we went live, the Kennedy School is where I did my MPP. So even though I know you're in the process of moving, it's great to be with anyone associated with the Kennedy School. And then it's nice to see Nils again. He and I are veterans of doing a few panels for the foundation together, which does such important work. Yesterday was both shocking and not surprising. This is the sort of Russian aggression that we have seen, whether it is Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2013, 2014. It just continues. And it is another reminder why you referenced that I'm a parliamentarian with NATO PA. And recently, in fact, the timing is kind of remarkable, just presented a report about how to deal with the Russian menace. And it's very long, and it is a draft report, so I won't go into the gritty details, but one of the bottom lines is NATO is needed now, perhaps more than any time since 1991. We're obviously in a different stage of relations, well beyond the sort of dawn of hope that we had from the 90s. But after 4 years of a very questionable U.S. commitment to NATO from the White House, although I would point out not from Congress, but from the White House, it's good to finally have the U.S. back as an active part in NATO. So the timing of the upcoming summits in Europe, I think, are very important. This should be really one of the top agenda items. And final point on this, it is in many ways, like in so many ways with this administration, it is back to the boring normal. It is making boring great again. It is making sure that the US and our European allies resume our traditional role as partners when it comes to combating the sort of provocative and aggressive moves we increasingly see from Russia and the satellites they basically control.
Nils Schmid, I was happy to see, or relieved to see, that the heads of various European parliamentary foreign affairs committees seemingly got on the phone together to issue a joint letter. So the chairman of the committee that you are part of, Norbert Röttgen, was a signatory to a starkly worded pushback. But of course, it seems that in this grave situation, just a semantic pushback might not be sufficient. So as I'm assuming you spent a number of hours, even though it's a holiday in Germany, on the phone this morning, can you give us some insight into the thinking both in Germany and possibly with coordinating with European partners about what might be next steps vis-a-vis the actions we saw yesterday?
Yeah, Cathryn, let me just thank the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for hosting this event, and I'm glad to see Brandon on this panel again. Hope to see him on a personal basis soon in Washington after I will get my second shot. So yes, indeed, I fully share the assessment by the chairman and chairwomen of the Foreign Affairs Committee you've mentioned. And the first thing we have to do is to push back semantically and by naming and shaming who is responsible for this act of state terrorism. And I want to stress that this act cannot have been undertaken without the consent and probably the active support of the Russian government. It seems that 4 Russian citizens also got off the plane in Minsk, not only the persecuted journalist Roman Protasevich, but also 4 Russian citizens, which more or less once again implies Russian security forces in this kind of operation, special operation, so to say, and which once again gives Russia a plausible deniability for what they are doing in this kind of hybrid warfare, so to say. And so, yes, naming and shaming is the first step. Now there's coordination going on in Brussels, since there's a European Council meeting scheduled for today and tomorrow. And we need to do both 2 things, in my view. One is to start inquiries and judicial prosecution of those who are responsible for this act, which means targeted sanctions for those in Belarus and Russia who are responsible for this kind of state terrorism. And the other thing we should do is to target the economic basis of Lukashenko's dictatorship. I'm very careful about broader economic sanctions against Belarus, because we should aim not the people of Belarus, but the power base of Lukashenko. So a sort of closing the border for commercial traffic or excluding Belarus from international aviation is a very difficult thing to do, because what we want to have is open borders and an open exchange with Belarusian society. We even want to facilitate visa-free travel between Belarus and the European Union. You know, Belarus is probably the country outside the EU which got the most of so-called Schengen visa. This means entry visas to the EU. And it's very important to keep the European Union open to civil society from Belarus. So yes, targeted sanctions against those who are responsible for this terrifying act, and also targeted sanctions aiming at the economic power base of Lukashenko's. These topics should be on the table now.
Congressman Boyle, I want to lean into this a little bit more with one extra round of questions. Of course, this idea of targeted sanctions got a boost on the European side, because since December of last year, we have the opportunity to do, at least on the European side, Magnitsky Act style sanctions. So trying to align sanctions regimes, however you frame it, both on the economic terms, as Nils Schmid has mentioned, but also in terms of humanitarian issues, which might in fact play a role here, similarly to the thinking around Alexei Navalny. If you think about sanctions, what are your hopes here? We're beginning to see certain parts of the political elite in Europe question the effectiveness of sanctions as our only tool. So if you could reflect on that. And then, of course, because I know you're at the heart of Congress and you're hearing the Republican voices become louder and more vociferous on Nord Stream 2, not least last week, where the Biden administration has been taking a very delicate and focused approach in addressing the German government. Is Nord Stream 2 now not an option that in the transatlantic context should be put on the table as an additional diplomatic tool vis-a-vis Russia? So those 2 questions. Oh, you're muted.
You would think after the last 15 months that wouldn't ever happen, and yet here we are. So a few things. First, as far as sanctions, we know they are an important but crude sort of tool, right? One need only look at U.S. policy toward Cuba over 6 decades to realize the limits of sanctions. Now, that doesn't mean sanctions are unimportant, though. They play a key role. They have had an effect on Russia ever since its takeover of Crimea and other actions in the east of Ukraine. you have to ensure, though, that the sanction regime doesn't have any holes in it. So that is key. I'm also mindful of the fact, and I heard this a lot back when I traveled to Germany some years ago, but sanctions were already applied at that point. The kind of sanctions we're talking about, frankly, there are some who pay a bigger price in Europe, particularly the closer you get to Russia, than those of us in the US. So that is also a careful balancing act. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a clamor for an increase in sanctions after this provocative, as Nils pointed out, action of state terrorism. And I think that will be bipartisan on Capitol Hill. Even during the Trump years, there was this sort of interesting kind of schizophrenia where you would have Republicans on Capitol Hill who backed Trump. But then when it came to, say, the Foreign Affairs Committee, when I was on at the time, most Republican members would still behave like the normal Republican Party of old when it came to combating, first the Soviet Union and then Russia. Now, you gave me the controversial question of Nord Stream 2. In fact, I make in the NATO PA report that I wrote, I have a reference to it. And sure enough, my friends and colleagues who serve as NATO parliamentarians from Germany have some amended language that they would like to use. I believe that has to be an issue. By the way, it's not just an issue on the Republican side. There's sort of an interesting mix of those of us on the Democratic side who, for foreign affairs and national security reasons, have deep concerns about Nord Stream 2. But then there are also the environmentalists as well who would oppose it for reasons that actually have nothing to do with national security. So the politics on this, in terms of Capitol Hill, are actually pretty complex. Now, I have to say, I mean, as someone who obviously comes from the Democratic side of the aisle, who opposed President Trump on most things, who really is very grateful, frankly, of the German role as the U.S. took itself off the world stage. Germany really stepped up and played that important, indispensable role as leader of the free world. I have to say, given that, the Nord Stream 2 position is rather disappointing. And I know it's complex. I've spoken to a number of German people, or a number of business people in Germany, and a number of folks who are active on both sides of the Atlantic here in the US and in Germany. I do think that this is something that at the very least merits further discussion as both the US-German relationship, but also broader the US-European relationship.
Well, it's surely going to be an issue in conversation at the EU-US summit, I would wager. Nils Schmid, you've taken a very nuanced approach to your piece on Nord Stream, not least to say it should be completed and still used as a diplomatic wager. So could you share, I don't know if your reflections at all have changed looking at the situation, or have become even more nuanced looking at the events of yesterday and the action that we have to, as part of the panoply of possible actions that could really infringe some or put some pain on the Russians. But I of course, I have to ask you to weigh in on that question.
Yes, of course. Let me start by saying that Nord Stream 2 is not a purely commercial project. And for too long, the German government and many German politicians have stated that they had nothing to do with this project. And this is completely wrong, of course. I've been myself in energy politics for some years now. In my former capacity as Minister of Finance, I was in the supervisory council of one of the leading energy companies in Germany that also imported gas from Russia, by the way. And so I know that energy and politics are very much linked one to another. And so there were a lot of mistakes from the German side. On the other hand, I do believe that we cannot only talk about Nord Stream 2 when it comes to the energy relationship with Russia. So if you want to sanction Russia or to punish Russia, you have to look at the whole picture of energy imports from Russia. There's oil being imported by the US, there's gas and oil being imported by European countries, among them Germany and others. There's LNG imported by Russian LNG imported by French companies through French LNG terminals. So let's talk about the whole picture, about the energy policy implications of our relationship with Russia. I believe that if you take this all together, you will abstain from having a sort of energy import embargo, because there's too much and there are too many connections between the West and Russia in energy terms. But I will be open for a debate on that, but then we have to include all kinds or all aspects, and not only Nord Stream 2. This is not fair and not honest. But then there's also the question: what can we do about our relationship with Russia? And I believe that we have to start a new debate about targeted sanctions. I believe that broad economic sanctions have too many disadvantages. But as we have seen the debate on kleptocracy, the debate on tax evasion, on the threat to democracy by corruption gaining traction in the US also, maybe we should start a transatlantic debate on how to protect our democracies and the fiscal basis of our democracies against this kind of corruption and tax evasion, and also political influence from obscure powers in our democracies. But Nord Stream 2 is not the only yardstick to assess if you're tough enough on Russia or not. So I would think that this is misleading, and unfortunately also because of German weakness and German failures, the debate has too narrowly focused on that sole project.
Well, this is almost an elegant connection to everything that needs to come on the table as part of the summits that we are looking at for June. There's sort of a Venn diagram overlap on these issues for the EU-NATO summit on June 14th, where NATO will make an opening bid toward a new strategic concept. That's been their thinking around the NATO 2030 process for a while. And the interesting thing to watch is how heads of state and government take them up on that. But there are critical issues there to look at. And then, of course, in that same sequence of days, there will be an EU-US summit. So naturally, my next question to both of you should be on the sequencing of the many possible issues we need to address in this transatlantic partnership. Both of you have alluded to the fact that we have lived through already in these first 100 days plus a rebalancing of the relationship. Congressman Boyle, you noted that explicitly in this transatlantic partnership, but there remains a significant trust gap, as we see in public opinion, certainly, and have seen most recently in a relatively shocking poll from early May, where Germans were asked which country has a more negative impact on their democracy. And we have to think about when these questions were asked. They were in a transition phase from one administration to another, and yet Germans felt that the Americans or the American side has a more negative impact on their democracy than, for instance, the Chinese. So that should give us some pause in terms of how our own populations are thinking about this relationship. But we have some very concrete issues to work down as the president travels to Europe. So maybe both of you could reflect on where you both see the priorities, knowing this relationship so well for both of these meetings, the NATO-US summit and the EU-US summit right after. Congressman Boyle.
Yeah, well, so I haven't seen the poll that you referenced. I have seen other polling, though, that shows kind of what one would expect, that for Germany, France, UK, some other European countries, the approval ratings of the US were extremely low, somewhere in the teens to 20s. I think the highest I saw was low 30s back over the last several years. And now in most of those countries, it is somewhere in the 60s, 70s, upwards of 80% range with the new administration. In some ways, that's not entirely new. During the George W. Bush years, you also would have seen very low ratings among, in terms of view of the U.S. Among European populations, as compared to, say, the Clinton years or the Obama years. So that part of it isn't new, though I would say with Trump, it reached an all-time low because Trump, one of his many outlandish views was that one of them, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the whole reason why, in his view, the whole reason why the European Union was founded was to oppose the United States, which of course is entirely patently false. The European Union, of which I'm a strong supporter, is the longest, most successful peace process in the history of Europe. So having a new president go there to express strong support for the US-EU relationship is important, especially after the trauma of the last 4 years. But I'm also mindful, because of the direct conversations I've had with a number of members of the Bundestag with whom I'm friends, but also members of other European parliaments, I do sense a certain, I won't say doubt, but a certain fear that, well, wait a minute, we're just one US election away from some things we never imagined actually happening. So I think it will take a while for the US-European relationship, which obviously overlaps to a great degree with the US-NATO relationship, to kind of return to normal and to restore to its solid footing. My last point on this, though, and it kind of reminds me of Build Back Better, which is the Biden presidency slogan, more domestically focused, but you could also apply it to foreign affairs. And that is to say, before Trump took office, there were still challenges in the US-European relationship. There were issues like what we do with sanctions, the energy debate. So it's not as if it was perfect before Trump. There were challenges that still need to be addressed, even predating him.
Do you have one or two things that are top of mind from your perspective for the president's inbox and his team as they get on those planes for June, where you say, well, in terms of sequencing and American interest and restoring trust, particularly for the Europeans, this should really be the top headline that comes out of the news conferences after these two summits?
We talked about two, Catherine, we talked about two specific ones that I would put very high already in terms of what we do about Russia. I would add, of course, what we do about China. Are they a constructive competitor, or are they an opponent or even an enemy? That is a very big and important question. I remember being in Hamburg, Germany for I think it was a G20 summit. And I saw the way President Xi was welcomed with open arms as if he was a great small d Democrat. And I was rather aghast. Now, I could sense that because obviously a lot of the focus was on President Trump. But I think the last several years have opened any eyes that need to be opened about China. But if I can take a step back from those specific things and talk about one very big one, it is that we are in a democracy recession around the world, and especially in the West, including in the US, as I saw vividly going through the last election and living through January 6th. For those of us who grew up at the end of the Cold War and had such great optimism and faith that in the early 90s, it was inevitable that democracy had triumphed. Boy, the last several years have been quite shattering. And I think that all of us who care about liberal democracy and our shared values really need to have that bigger, more philosophical conversation.
I think that's critical, and we'll lean into a couple of those points, China specifically, in our next round. But Nils Schmid, I'm assuming that there's some frantic preparation going on, not only in the German capital, but into your reaches in Brussels as well. There's critical issues. There's the taxation question, both on digital terms, but also on general corporate terms. There's big economic questions to approach as part of this summitry. How do you look, particularly given the trust deficit that Germans still seem to have vis-a-vis the United States? I'm not going to say this administration. How do you look at the sequencing that should be on the table for these meetings in June?
The lack of trust and the polls you mentioned just show how deep the disappointment in Germany was about the US in the last few years. It does not show that we prefer the Chinese system to the US system. It just demonstrates that many Germans expect the US to be a leader on human rights and democracy. And what we have seen over the last 5 years before Biden took over was a huge disappointment, especially by those in Germany who have felt close to the US over the last 5 or 6 decades. And that explains why at the moment and after the transition or during the transition from Trump to Biden, there was such a low approval of the US government in Germany. And it all depends on the president. Sorry for Congressman Boyle and for us parliamentarians, but the image of the US, the reputation of the US is mainly linked to the reputation of the president. And so Trump had a devastating effect on German public opinion on the US as a whole in general. And so Biden's visit to Brussels and to the EU summit and the NATO summit is a very great thing for us Europeans, because Biden sort of pays tribute to the most important alliances we in Europe have at our disposal and have developed over the last 70 years. NATO, which is a transatlantic alliance, and the European Union, which is more of a European thing, but has always been supported by any US government with the exception of Trump, unfortunately. And so it's really great that Biden starts his first physical visit to Europe by introducing himself to these two institutions. And this is very much like how we Germans, and especially German social democrats, see foreign policy. We see it through the focus of the European Union and NATO as our main political frameworks for foreign policy. And then there's a second point I would like to make. What we've seen since Biden took over is a Biden team and also many Democrats in Congress in listening mode. So there's a genuine interest from our American friends to learn what Europeans think about foreign policy issues, Afghanistan, the Middle East, Russia, China, and so on. This is very important. And it's also a challenge for us to define what we would like to stand for and what we want to do together in cooperation with the US. And so this is really a very important moment. And I believe that Russia and China will be on the table, as Brandon rightly mentioned, but also the larger issue of democratic systems of government versus authoritarian forms of governance. And this should not be overplayed. So there is always a need to have diplomatic relations to all kinds of governments all over the planet. But still, we feel that we are challenged. We face a challenge from authoritarian governments, especially from the Chinese variant of it. And that's why we need an ever closer cooperation on very fundamental issues like rule of law, fiscal equality, international fiscal equality, and cooperation against kleptocratic regimes.
So you're leading into the next area already I want to discuss with you both. And I'm seeing also the chat here. And thank you for your questions. We have only another 5 minutes to go. So the two issue areas I want to leave put into our conversation and have you both comment on them. And so I'll fold them into one, though they don't necessarily connect, is precisely on China. Nils Schmid, you prepared a very interesting paper that sort of nuances out exactly what Congressman Boyle was referring to. Do we see China just as a systemic, or do we see China as a systemic opponent, but a collaborator in other critical issues? You write very nuanced, you have a very nuanced opinion on this. But I wanted to ask you specifically, since you are in the Bundestag and we're facing an election in September, Does the German public understand how vital these questions are, these systemic questions are? And if they don't fully, from your vantage point and turning into an election cycle right now, how do you communicate this in a way that our publics pick this up? I think in the United States, people are very keenly attuned to at least the challenge from China. And then to both of you, I just want to end, of course, on a pertinent question, because the American Secretary of State is effectively on a plane right now heading to the Middle East and Israel and the Palestinian territories. How we think about transatlantic efforts at resolving this long-standing conflict, which has troubled us so over these last few days, and will continue to be something that overshadows the capacity of our transatlantic diplomacy to restore truly peace in that particular region. So I'll start with you, Nils Schmid, and I'll add one asterisk on China. Somebody is asking in the chat how Europeans are observing the narrowing of the gap between China and Russia, so that closer collaboration. So how does the German public think on the China question, and how should we think about the rapprochement between China and Russia?
Over the last 4 years, there has been a shift in the German debate on China. We used to focus only on the economy and on business opportunities there. Now it is the business community in Germany that has started to rethink its connection to China. So it was a business association who introduced the idea of systemic rivalry in a well received paper. And I believe that, as always in Germany, the business community will be a very important trigger for this debate. And we also started a China debate in Parliament. And whatever the next coalition will be after the German elections, there will be a new China policy in Germany, because Merkel is not ready for any change in her China policy. She just wants to administer her legacy in terms of China policy, and has blocked a lot of debates and also a very important piece of legislation on the 5G networks for too long. But any new German government will have a fresh look and a broader look at our relationship with China. When it comes to the Middle East, we need more US involvement, frankly speaking. And you cannot leave the issue off the table, the issue of the Palestine-Israeli conflict. It's still a searing wound. And you may have as many peace agreements between Arab states and Israel, which is all fine, but you have to solve somehow this conflict sooner or later. And that's why it was very good that the Biden team and the special envoy took over and also pushed for a ceasefire. Now we have to push for a continuation of peace talks, or a resuming of peace talks. And the EU and US have to work together in the so-called quartet. And but without the push from the US, the EU is too weak and also too divided, I must say, on this issue. So without help from Washington, this will not reach, and there will not an agreement be reached.
Congressman Boyle, you're going to have the last word, and it's like a minute of your time because you have to head off at 1:45. So let me already say thank you to both of you, and have you have the last word on these two critical issues.
Yeah, you know, since it's such brief time, and I already referenced China before, why don't I take right where Nils left off with the Middle East. We have essentially, I mean, we being the situation, all of us have essentially been stuck in the same cul-de-sac since the failed Camp David attempt in 2000, when Arafat and Ehud Barak were not able to successfully culminate the Oslo peace process, led to the Intifada, what at that point was the latest Intifada. And really, there has not been a serious effort since, although Ehud Olmert, right before they were taking him off in handcuffs, did attempt to resuscitate peace talks, and a new Palestinian leader at that point, Mahmoud Abbas, didn't take him up on it, it seems. So essentially, for the last 2 decades, this is where we've been stuck. Now, I do believe there will be a new Israeli prime minister. I know never count Netanyahu out. He has more than 9 lives, but it does seem from the latest reporting I was reading this morning from the Jerusalem Post, it does seem as if Naftali Bennett will join with Yamina, will join their own interesting coalition of the willing, basically the anti-Netanyahu coalition. And it does look rather dire that Netanyahu will remain as prime minister. So having a new Israeli prime minister, even one who, if it's Bennett, will clearly be right of center, and then to be succeeded by someone who's more of a centrist, that might present an opportunity. If the Palestinians would ever actually hold an election, Mahmoud Abbas in his late 80s may very well be replaced at some point soon. So that combined with just how awful the 11 days were recently of fighting, that might present an opportunity that hasn't really existed for quite some time. The real tragedy is we all know eventually this has to end if it's going to be peacefully resolved in a 2-state solution. And obviously the closer and the quicker we can bring about that day, the better Israelis, Palestinians, and all of us will be.
Well, Congressman Boyle, you've done what we try to teach at the Kennedy School, so you're making your alma mater proud. I should note that Nils Schmid also had a privilege. We sat next to another at the closing dinner of attending the Kennedy School for a couple of weeks. Our principle here is to try to imbue hope even in drastic and complicated situations and map out possibilities toward actually advancing political impasses. So thank you for those comments. This has been a rapid 45 minutes in which we have turned over the globe. But I think what this underlines is that we need to be continuously aligned at the hip, the United States and the European Union, but particularly also the United States and Germany, which faces a critical moment in September in which I think new avenues for German foreign policy will emerge. I want to thank both of you for your time, the audience for their attentiveness and additional questions, and the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung for hosting us on this American afternoon and evening in Germany. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.